Well, thank you. Can you guys hear me all right? Yeah, good? All right, great. So basically, today's talk, what I'm going to try to dive deep into is really make a case for validation in long-term forecasting, resource planning, and resource adequacy assessments. The agenda for today, just so you have an idea, I know it's hard to compete against snacks, but we're here. Hopefully I'll keep you entertained. I'm going to go through basically, define validation, because it has a specific definition. It's important to understand. I'm going to talk about why validation is important. Then I'm going to talk about a framework by which you can go ahead, and a process by which you can go ahead and do validation. And then I'm going to go into different case studies of validation. Some of the case studies are going to have to do with demand forecasting, because demand forecasting are inputs to resource adequacy assessments. And I'm going to talk about data center load, which is a very important topic today. I'm also going to talk about weather impacts as well, and how that affects load. And then, another component of validation is looking at the methodology and the outcomes. So we're going to look at, some backcasting of resource adequacy assessments in CAISO. And then we're also going to look at a case study in Chile of resource adequacy forecasting. And then we're going to do validation around some important assets as well, which are, energy storage, and what is the contribution of energy storage and how it would operate in the future. And then I'm going to consolidate and say, hey, this is how we think about using PLEXOS in validation. So what is validation? There's a difference between validation and verification, which I think it's important to understand. Validation is really trying to understand, how the system essentially, envision the system against its operational reality. That's one component of it, trying to understand its operations. We're running these models. Does it make sense operationally? Are we really getting to operational reality? Also making sure that we're meeting system needs as well. So those are the two components of validation, which is different than verification. Verification is when you go into the model and you check the technical requirements, right? You're checking that the generators have the right parameters, the lines have the right parameters. Validation is really this broader idea of, are we meeting the needs? Are we getting the operational reality right? And there's a feedback process, right? It's an iterative process where you're checking the operations of the system and you're checking against how it's doing. There's different tools, and you're making sure that you're meeting the system needs and system goals. Why is it important? Well, I think there's a lot of operational uncertainty and complexity, and that is rising over time. And there's a lot of drivers around, creating this operational uncertainty and, operational complexity. And we've talked about this today. We have new large loads, right, like data centers. We have to decarbonize the load. There's retirements of existing assets. We have aging infrastructure. We have impacts of externalities such as weather. We also have the load having a broader participation. So there's a lot of moving parts, which is creating this uncertainty. And this can lead to challenges, right? It can create cost pressures. It could affect reliability. It could also make us not meet the sustainability objectives. And validation can help us strengthen and understand this operational uncertainty, right, and deal with this, right? Why is validation important? I asked AI to do this, which is great. I was like, whoa, this is crazy. So I put Charlie Munger. I don't know if you know Charlie Munger, and Albert Einstein. Everybody probably knows Albert Einstein. And there's two quotes that are quite relevant from these two characters. One from Charlie Munger: when we're thinking about validation, we want to make sure that we're trying to observe operational reality, right? We're real with ourselves. Is the resource adequacy assessment really what we expect operationally? Is the plan, are we really going to be able to meet it in terms of how the system is operating? And, recognizing the reality, this is what Charlie said, even when you don't like it, especially when you don't like it, right? That's what we need to be focused on validation. But then there's another component which, Einstein was more of a visionary. And there's also, we a lot of times don't have historical data. We're going to have to look into an uncertain future. And so we have to envision that operational reality, right? And the important, what Einstein used to say is, the important thing is not to stop questioning. Curiosity has its own reason for existing. One cannot be in awe when contemplates the mysteries of eternity, of life, of the marvelous structure of reality, essentially. But it's like we kind of have to look for it and look for scenarios so we can envision that reality. So there's two components. And remember these two quotes. There's the observing operational reality and envisioning the operational reality, two very important components of validation. Validation, is all about really trying to solve the interchanges or the relationship interdependence between in the validation triangle. And so what is the validation triangle? Is the interaction between system planning, operational reality, and system needs, essentially, and the interfaces amongst them, right? And it is important to think about the interfaces, right? Because a lot of the times, we're defining these objectives and these sustainability goals, but they can't be achieved operationally, right? People aren't really understanding if those goals can be met. So it's important to do validation to make sure that the intersection between system needs and operational reality is actually being met. It's also, the idea of grounding the system planning in operational reality and system needs and trying to understand the interactions. And we'll talk more about that through the case studies. So whenever we're thinking about validation, there's different components about validation in a process that you can follow. Got to validate different parts of the process. So, and we're going to go through the case studies. We're going to go through some of these validation parts of the process. So you got to validate the assumptions, right? You got to make sure that, if you have a load forecast, it makes sense, right? It's an achievable load forecast, or you're capturing the range of uncertainty within that load forecast. You also have to validate the scenarios that you're developing, right? Because you can choose what scenarios you're going to be running. You got to validate the methodology and approach. How are you using the tools and the process that you're doing? Is it valid, right? Can you meet and do you have a way to get to operational reality and meeting the system needs? You got to validate the results themselves and make sure that the results make operational sense. You got to validate against system needs, right? Validate against the stakeholders. And I'm not going to go through all of them, but come and see me and we can talk about this in more depth. But I'm going to try to highlight some of these through the different case studies. So the first case study we're going to go is we did a benchmark of data center forecasts across 9 planning areas in North America, essentially. And this is a notional map. It's hard to get a good map, but not all the regions are represented perfectly. But we looked at these planning areas, essentially. And when we looked at these planning areas, some regions, and this was conducted back in January 2026, so things have changed a lot. So the results are from there, so don't hold me accountable for that. But essentially, some planning areas didn't have forecasts of data center load. Some did. Some have much more sophisticated planning processes. And we looked at these forecasting processes and the results to try to basically get conclusions out of this benchmark, essentially. And so the first thing we looked at is we wanted to compare the growth rates of the different regions, right? And we compared the growth rates of short-term, which is between 2025 and 2030, midterm 2030 to 2025, long-term 2035 to 2040, based on the published values by these different areas. And we saw, we compared the peak growth load, right, in the top graph, and then the annual load growth, essentially. And we start seeing some very interesting trends, right? One thing we see is that a lot of regions have a lot of growth in the short term, but no growth in the long term. So that tells us something about the load forecast, right? Regions, are they only considering bottoms up, essentially, load forecasts where they're grabbing all the projects and trying to come up with a forecast? Do they really have a sense or trying to assess what could happen in the long term, what is a market demand essentially for AI data centers, essentially hyperscalers. So that's a question that arises, right? Some of the regions had significant growth. Then we also we benchmarked the system impact, right? The percentage of load, the percentage of peak load, and the percentage of demand for these different regions. So we have regions like ERCOT, essentially, when you look at the forecasts and you look at some of the scenarios, the different scenarios that were published, these were published by the different entities, you see that they're forecasting that they're all almost going to have to build another half state of Texas in order to basically account for the data center growth by 2030, 2035, essentially. And the growth rates are different and the impacts are different across the different regions, but the impact is important. So whenever we benchmarked these planning or these forecasting processes, we try to extract and say, what are the important components of a forecasting process that would make sense for this data center growth, right? And we came up with these elements of a robust forecasting process, which includes validation. So whenever you're trying to forecast data center growth, essentially load growth, the first thing you got to do is, and people are doing these in different ways, is you got to track the state, the attributes, and construction data around the development pipeline, right? So you're gathering data, but it's important also not to track just the traditional parameters like demand in the data centers, but also, hey, is the data center bringing its own generation? Is the demand flexible, right? Because that's going to help you make different types of assessments, right? Also, track different maturity indicators, right? What in the different region determines how mature a project is down the pipeline, right? And so you basically come up with this, template to track the data, right? And people and planning regions are doing it a different way. Then you got to generate scenarios, right? And I think there's so much uncertainty, you got to generate multiple scenarios, right? Whenever you're doing. You also have to be, whenever you have a good process for forecasting, you have to clearly define the assumptions, define the limitations, make sure you're capturing the uncertainty envelope around the forecast of the data center demand. And then there's two things that you got to do in terms of validation. Do a bottoms-up validation, right? And a top-down validation, right? And the bottoms-up validation is, hey, I start gathering probabilistic assessment or statistics around how projects are being developed and how, for example, a particular project in a particular state, if they, with certain maturity indicators, could those help me determine if the project's going to make it to completion, right? So you start gathering that information so you can make this bottoms-up assessment and you can prune the development pipeline, right? So that's one thing you got to gather. But you also have to do some top-down validation. And that top-down validation means how much is the market willing to bear, right? What is going to be the real demand from AI, right? And here, what we're trying to do is we're not trying essentially to, get one scenario right, but what we're trying to get is the uncertainty envelope, right? So as an example of top-down validation, to define this uncertainty envelope, Google in 2025 released data around how much, a medium prompt, an AI prompt, how much electricity it would consume, right? And they also said that in the previous 12 months, the consumption of energy per prompt went down by 33-fold, essentially, right? So whenever we're thinking about top-down validation, how much is really going to be the AI demand, we need to start tracking these types of parameters, right? It's AI, use is highly uncertain, but we have to think about these things so we can, sort of make sure that our assessments are real. And we're also capturing not only the high demand scenarios and planning against those high demand scenarios, which a lot of the times come from the construction through this project development pipeline, right? You're just lining up all the projects in the region and coming up with a very high demand forecast for data centers. But it's also important to consider, a low demand scenario, because if we don't plan for the low demand scenario, then that could lead to overinvestment, essentially. That could lead to increasing costs for consumers, right? Since we're going to be building much more capacity for certain things that we need to. And if we look at ERCOT's 2025 forecast, essentially, they said that post-2030, they would need, in the high scenario, they would require about 880 terawatt hours per year. And if we grab the population of the United States over 18 in 2025, essentially, that would mean that, and given the Google data that was published, that would mean that each person above 18 in the US to meet that demand in ERCOT would have to basically do 37,000 prompts per day, essentially. Is that a possible scenario? We don't know how much AI is going to be used, but we start seeing, hey, this is a high scenario, right? So are we really getting a low scenario, essentially? AI is going to be used in many different ways that we can't imagine. I can't sit here and say exactly how it's going to be used, but we can start saying, hey, if we do top validation and understanding the reality, we can also start, capturing this envelope of uncertainty. Then another thing is the validation of essentially weather on resource forecast, on load forecasts used and resource assessments, and also resource plans. So we did a benchmark across different cities in the Americas of how temperature affects load. And we looked at the data for the past 6 years to do this assessment. And I'm not going to share all the details on this assessment, but what I'm trying to show you here is that we capture cities with very different climate, essentially. Cities that are much colder, cities that are much warmer, essentially. Here are some of the days with high and low temperatures in 2024. So you see the diversity of the cities that we captured in this benchmark. And I want to explain how to use some of this historical data to do validation. So there's a correlation between the energy consumed in these cities, essentially per day, and the average temperature. And all the cities show the same trend, essentially, across all the different years, right? So as the temperature gets cooler, we have higher daily consumption, right? And that's what we show in the graphs, right? The average daily temperature against the daily demand, essentially, for different cities. So the trend is very similar in all the cities. They just have different temperatures and different consumption patterns, essentially, right? Some are more electrified, some are less electrified. And the metric we calculated for these cities, essentially, is how much the daily load would increase, essentially, which is the slope of the line, essentially, how much the daily load would increase by a 10-degree temperature change, essentially. So, for example, with cooling, right, in Buenos Aires, essentially, a 10-degree change during 2024, right, if the temperature was 10 degrees hotter, it would lead to 53% more consumption in daily demand. So remember this slope. And we compare it, right, this slope, we compare it across the different cities, across all the different years. And for example, this helps us do validation, because what we're trying to do validation is we're making sure that the forecast models that we're getting for the load actually are making sense, and we're putting the right inputs into the model. Operationally, they make sense. So for example, Calgary, depends a lot on gas, essentially. So, for every 10 degrees in temperature change, the demand only changed 10%. So, in the short term, there's not a lot of variability, right? It's essentially that slope, it's pretty steady. But in the milder temperatures with the number 2, the cities with the number 2, there's a lot of variability. For example, in San Diego, one year, a 10-degree change led to a 20% increase in daily demand, while another year, 10-degree change led to a 40% growth in demand. And so that's important when we're running these scenarios. We have to capture the diversity and making sure that the forecasts in our models are right. And then we see a city like Santo Domingo, which is really rapidly electrifying over the summer. And so it went from 20% change with a 10-degree temperature change to 80%, right? So this is what happens when you have rapid electrification and changing use in demand. So it's very important to use validation historically to basically, make sure that the inputs and assumptions you're putting into the model are right. And this is how you could, for example, do validation using some of the historical data. We're going to show 2 case studies rapidly around resource adequacy outcomes. So we're going to see how resource adequacy assessments and how to do that, how to look at the results of resource adequacy assessments, both in CAISO and in Chile. So what we did in CAISO is we looked, every year CAISO publishes a summer loads assessment. And so we went back and back tested all the different years of the summer loads assessment, where they basically do a resource adequacy assessment and they say, hey, in the summer, we're going to have these resource adequacy issues for the next year. So we went back and back tested that. And we did it for 2022, 2023, 2024, 2025. And what we show is the different energy emergency alerts, right? So EEA3 is the worst, right? Because you could have load shedding, essentially. So 2022 was a very interesting year. There was a lot of alerts. There was a heat wave, right? And so that led to a lot of challenges. So we could look more deeply around that and doing the backcasting of that. But when we look at the assessment and we look back at see how CAISO, what they did in this resource adequacy assessment for the summer the year before, they actually, in the 2022 assessment, they said, hey, we think there could be a 4% chance of unserved energy, an EA3 alert, essentially, which was pretty dead on, essentially. There was a lot of challenges on 2022. So they assessed that probability. And if we look, here's a picture of the actual load during the days of the highest demand and the 1 in 10 load, essentially, that CAISO forecasted. So the 1 in 10 load is the worst scenario that they consider in this resource adequacy assessment. And you can see that the actual maximum load was pretty close to that 1 in 10 forecast, right? So they did a pretty good job with the load. But when we're doing backcasting, we're also trying to learn, hey, what are some of the things that we need to think about going into the future? And if we think of CAISO going into the future, there's going to be a lot of storage, right, in a lot of these markets. CAISO already has a lot of storage integration. And so one thing that happened during these days of high demand, the generation was 30% lower, right? And we're looking at this in some of the other years. And actually, some years, it was even 50% lower, essentially. So the question we need to be asking whenever we're doing validation for future resource adequacy assessments, are we modeling solar in the right way? Are we considering these drops? Because where are the batteries going to be charged if we're not considering that? So this backcasting helps us also do this validation. In Chile, we did a case study, right? And we published this paper with Partilla. This is not backcasting, but we ran scenarios going into the future, and we ran different scenarios with different levels of reliability stress. And so we had a base case and a higher stress scenario where we didn't have any investment in gas, so gas retirement, faster retirement of coal. We also had different levels of solar integration. And whenever we did these, this assessment going into the future, this is a day in 2032, a day of peak demand. And basically, based on the capacity accreditation, the way that it is defined for resource adequacy in Chile, if we use the methodology that is currently defined, it shows that there would be, in 2032, 35 gigawatts of capacity, right? And the black line is the maximum demand that we saw for 2032 in our model. But if we actually went through a process where we actually adjusted that capacity in a way considering new operational constraints, like, for example, removing solar from the night, because they accredit solar in the night as well. So if we just remove solar from the night, if we consider wind scarcity scenarios during the night, if we consider scarcity hydro scenarios and thermal scenarios, we get to much lower capacity than it is actually ability, so a much lower reserve margin, right? And we did this across the different scenarios that I showed you, and what we start seeing by introducing these operational constraints, which you could use PLEXOS to do, we start seeing that actually the reserve margin is not as big as you really think through the capacity accreditation mechanism. We start getting to very low reserve margins in certain scenarios across the different scenarios, right? With gas retirements and high levels of energy storage integration. Then finally, the final case study is around the validation of the contribution of energy storage and its operations. We also did a benchmark across all these wholesale electricity markets to look how batteries behave in terms of energy arbitrage. So these are the different markets that we have been looking at. And these markets have been growing very rapidly. This is the amount of energy storage that has been installed in these different markets. CAISO and ERCOT are leading out of these wholesale electricity markets. But I mean, Chile is interesting because it has 2.2 gigawatts, but the demand is 10 gigawatts in Chile, essentially. So that means that it's gotten to 20% of the maximum demand, which is pretty close. If we do that same calculation for ERCOT and CAISO, they have much higher demand. It's pretty high. It's also around 20 to 30%. So also very high integration as well. So what we wanted to see is, hey, how do the spot price signals incentivize batteries, right? The reality of operations of batteries. If we look at 2025, so we show the average daily spot price essentially for the first quarter, second quarter, third quarter, fourth quarter for the different markets essentially for the real time. And what we see, and we start to see in some of these markets with high integration of storage, is we have two peaks of spot prices, right? One in the traditional peak hours, but one in the morning, right? And one would expect that peak to be there during the winter because the demand goes up. But that peak is also happening during the summertime as well in some of these markets. It's happening in EMO, it's happening in Spain, it's happening in Chile, it's happening in CAISO, right? So essentially, whenever we're doing forecasting and resource adequacy assessment, if we're not considering this morning peak and we're not capturing that in our model, then we might not be really, actually valuing the contribution of storage for resource adequacy, or really actually understanding the value of storage for in a long-term plan, essentially. And what we see here is, for example, this is when energy storage would have had to dispatch to capture the maximum arbitrage value, the first differential between the lowest spot price and the highest spot price. And we start seeing that in some markets, right, that night, dispatching during the night or during the peak hours is very important. And if we don't capture that in our models, then we're actually underestimating or not estimating properly the value of storage as it would operate in a resource adequacy assessment or long-term planning. So to bring it all together, how do we use PLEXOS for validation, essentially? Well, we showed this process, and PLEXOS is really important, and we use it a lot in the methodology and approach, right? PLEXOS can be one of those elements that you can use to validate the methodology and approach. Whenever you're using PLEXOS, right, and we've used PLEXOS, I mean, we could use PLEXOS for system planning, right? For system operation forecasts, resource adequacy assessments, resource planning and transmission planning. But what we can also do is we can look at the assessment and then say, how do we run additional scenarios to test that operational reality, right? More detailed production cost models to say, hey, we see these outputs from these system plans and this reliability. How can we, model in more detail the operational reality? We can also use PLEXOS to assess whether we're meeting the system needs or not, right? Are we meeting the targets that we need to do that? So we can use PLEXOS in that way. So remember that picture that I showed from Einstein and Charlie Munger? Well, we can use PLEXOS to validate the envision, what Einstein talked about, right? Validating the envisioned operational reality. We also have to validate the observed operational reality. So use historical data, and we could do historical analysis. Like I showed you, we could do backcasting to see if we're actually meeting the new trends that are going to be big into the future. We can also use expert judgment. We can use PLEXOS to envision the operational reality by doing production cost modeling, trying to emulate the real-time operations and see if our assessments are actually meeting operational reality in the future. We can do integrated operational assessments of stressful periods as well. And with that, I finished my presentation. There's my contact information. If you guys have any questions, come and see me.